everyone, and thank you for joining us on the Investigative Journal. I'm Tal Henrik in Times Square, New York. A bloody month in Iraq. This October, nationwide protests have erupted over high unemployment, poor public services, and mainly a corrupt political system. One that has existed in the country since the toppling of Saddam Hussein in 2003. A government committee investigating the wave of unrest found that 157 people, mostly civilians, were killed because security forces used excessive force and live fire. International, domestic, and sectarian criticism came quickly. The UN urged Iraq to investigate the deaths. Countries issued travel warnings. Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi reshuffled his cabinet and promised reforms as the country's Grand Ayatollah, Ali Sistani, blamed his government for the deaths and called for calm. Predicating this recent upsurge in domestic discontent were two statements from Iran. Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's powerful Quds force, reportedly told Iranian proxy militias in Iraq that they should be ready for a proxy war. The Iranian ambassador to Iraq warned American forces that Iran would attack if they felt America was trying to manipulate its influence in Iraq after pulling out of northeast Syria. Now, to make some order and break down all these tensions playing out in Iraq, we're joined by Michael Pregent, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute from Washington, D.C. Michael, welcome to the program.
And thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Good morning.
Michael, in recent years, after the toppling of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, of course, with the push of foreign players, Iraq has established a complicated sectarian political system that many in the West hailed as democracy. But given the images we've seen recently coming from the country, it's definitely not a functioning one. Is it really the main issue behind these protests, just like protests, by the way, that we see in Lebanon?
Right. It's these protesters are the loudest voice in Iraq, and we should have been listening to them. Remember a year and a half ago when these protesters burned down the Iranian consulate in Basra and attacked militia offices. They were condemned. They were condemned by the U.S. State Department. They were condemned by Brett McGurk. And instead, we should have listened to them instead of shoring up the political parties that they're protesting against. And these protests, like in Lebanon, are against the mismanagement of an economy and government systems that seem more beholden to Tehran than to the Iraqi people. They're not asking for health care. They're not asking for a lot of things. They're asking for water, electricity, and internet. And their government can't provide it. And this is a government that exports 3.6 million barrels of oil a day, and Iraqis aren't seeing the benefits of that economic surge that they should be.
So many of the protesters in Iraq have been chanting slogans against Iran and against the Iranian Shiite clerics in Qom and in Tehran. Do you believe that Iran is somehow involved in suppressing or manipulating these protests?
Absolutely. It's the Hashd al-Shabi, the IRGC-linked militias that are actually wearing the masks, that are actually responsible for conducting sniper operations against the Iraqi people. I mean, hundreds of civilians have been shot by the security forces wearing masks and wearing black pajamas. You know, these are the signs of the Shia militias. These are the signs of the militias tied to Iran. And if this was happening in Hong Kong, there'd be international outrage. But because it's happening in Baghdad, we're turning a blind eye, and we should pay attention to it because this is an embarrassment to the U.S. continued support of a government that can't serve its people and a government that's beholden to Tehran.
You make a good point. So just to get things straight, in Iraq, not only that you have the Sunni, Shiite, Kurdish tensions and the U.S. versus Iranian influence in the country, you also have Iraqi Shiites who protest against Shiite Iranian involvement in the country?
Yeah, that's the loudest voice are actually coming from the Shia population under the age of 30. 70% of Iraq's population are under the age of 30, and they're protesting against religious rule of Iraq. Now, the Sunnis and the Kurds are standing on the sidelines because anytime they protest, they get met with severe force and punishment. The Shia youth are key to Iraq's future. We need to identify the influencers ahead of the 2022 elections in Iraq and actually start putting a spotlight on them so that the Iraqi government and its security forces can't make them disappear. And that's something that we need to look at now, and nobody's paying attention to it.
So let's dig deeper into Iran's role in Iraq. Can you give us a little history of the roles of the different Shiite militias there? You have the Shabiha, or Popular Mobilization Forces. You also have the Badr Organization, the Mahdi Army. Are they all influenced by Iran?
So Muqtada al-Sadr's force, Saraya al-Salam, is being marginalized by Iran and marginalized by the IRGC-linked militias like Asab al-Haq, Badr Corps, Kitab Hezbollah, and others. And that's important because Muqtada al-Sadr, even though he's not currently aligned with Iran, is still being rejected by the Shia youth protesters. They don't want to have the status quo politicians and figureheads have any association with this grassroots protest, these grassroots protests that are leaderless. This is important. But yes, Iran has influence through Dawa Party, through other religious parties, through the Fatah-Bina coalition. Fatah and State of Law formed the Bina Party. There's so much influence in Iran. Now, we understand that a border country, neighbors should actually have a relationship, but we're looking for a Canada-U.S. relationship, not a relationship that's similar to Russia and Ukraine's.
Now, during the time of Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni dictator, many of these Shiite organizations seemed connected to Iran, serving as opposition. But after Saddam Hussein fell from power, the elected prime ministers of Iraq, they have all been Shiite. So now circling back to the protest, what is the role of the Sunni and Kurdish minorities right now?
Well, the Sunni and Kurdish parties will tell you, under this current system, there will never be a Sunni prime minister. There will never be a Kurdish prime minister. The prime minister will always be Shia. It doesn't have to be a hardliner pro-Tehran politician or prime minister. It simply has to be one that will bend, one that will break, and one that will facilitate what Qasem Soleimani wants to do in Iraq. And those are the grievances. Only 33% of Iraqis showed up in the last election, and Muqtada al-Sadr's party came in first. A militia party tied to Tehran came in second, and Prime Minister Abadi's party, the Nusra organization, came in third. Didn't even have a chance, or Nasser organization. That's the issue. Voices aren't being heard. They don't have politicians they can vote for. The lists are decided ahead of the elections, and it's not an election. It's a selection process that favors Tehran. And you hear Sistani. Sistani is telling the protesters not to be violent and telling the security forces not to be violent. But nobody's listening to Sistani anymore. They listen to him when they agree with him, and they pretend they don't hear what he's saying when they disagree with him. And that's another issue in Iraq.
Well, here's what I'm thinking. When you're looking at the bigger picture of Sunni versus Shiite tensions in the region, and you see Turkey's game-changing moves on Syria with Erdogan's plan to inject millions of Sunni refugees back in the country, and you're looking at the masses in Lebanon that dare to speak out against powerful Hezbollah. What's the impact, Michael, of all of this on Iraq? Does it embolden the Sunnis in the country?
Well, if you look at the protests in Lebanon and the protests in Iraq, they're very similar. They're leaderless. They're opposed to the status quo. They're opposed to Iran's influence in both countries. But the Sunnis have been punished severely under this ISIS campaign for speaking out and for protesting and for demanding governance, better governance. So I think they're waiting to see what the Shia youth do. And if you look at the situation in Syria, it's destabilizing. Not so much for Lebanon, but destabilizing for Iraq, destabilizing for Syria, and destabilizing for the Levant, to include Jordan and Israel.
Michael Pregent, thank you for helping us understand Iraq a little better today. Great to see you as always, and great analysis.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And also joining us from Washington, D.C. to discuss the situation in Iraq is Entifadh Qanbar. He's the founder and president of the Future Foundation. Welcome, Entifadh. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
You've lived in Washington, D.C. You lived in Baghdad, both for significant periods of your life. You're also very connected to everyday Iraqis trying to get their stories out over social media to the rest of the world. And I understand that you have some news to break with us this morning that you discussed with our producers before. concerning the real damage and the horror taking place on the streets of Iraq. So what's the scope that you're aware of?
The scope is what we have now is a millennial generation going out on the street that just became tall enough and strong enough to walk on their legs. This millennial generation will change Iraq, and I think it will change the Middle East. They are fearless because they never lived under Saddam's terror. They never lived under totalitarian regime. They lived after 2003. They saw the American soldiers in the streets. They were not killing people. They were not raping people. But they saw Shia militias and Shia parties, which are supported by Iran, embezzling the society, killing them, torturing them, raping people. So they are fearless. They are anti-Iranian naturally. They are anti-mullahs of Tehran naturally, and they are anti-corruption. They don't necessarily have an idea of political idea or a policy, but they are anti-establishment, which is basically relying completely, as we speak now, on Iran.
And what are you hearing, Entifadh, about the level of violence in these protests?
The level of violence is unmatchable. If I can tell you, in the beginning of October events, in 4 days, the numbers declared was 150 of dead, killed by snipers, Shia militias, Iranian militia snipers, Al-Khurasani brigades to be specific. But the real number from a very authorized medical source in Iraq told me the real number of the dead is 652. That's six times higher than the number that Iraqis lost in liberating the city of Mosul from ISIS. Wow. This is a battleground. This is not a demonstration. Even the Prime Minister of Iraq, Abdul Mahdi, incidentally, he called it, he mistakenly said in one of his speeches, engagement. The engagement with the demonstrators, as if he's talking about a battleground. And today I received a phone call at 6 a.m. telling me 2 demonstrators were killed in the center of Baghdad, and the killing spree is continuing. Khamenei made it very clear. Khamenei rarely responds to events in the world. He responded to these demonstrations by saying, we're not going to let Iraq split from Iran. And he basically issued orders to his militias and proxies inside Iraq to kill the demonstrators. I just heard a few minutes before I came on the air with you that Maliki's house in his hometown, Toyrij, was attacked by demonstrators, and his family has to run away. So it is really groundbreaking, and I think this is a major split from Iranian mullahs led by young millennials. Their age ranges between 15 to 20.
So in your opinion, that is the source of these protests in Baghdad and Basra and the rest of the country? Iran is at the very center?
It is at the very center. You brought up a very important point, Tal, because these are Shia. These are hardcore Shia, because they used to be, if the Sunni demonstrate or react or a Kurd, they would say it's a sectarian. These are Shia hardcore. That's what's threatening Iran. This is an earthquake coming to the mullahs in Tehran, because these are hardcore Shia. No one can claim these are anti-sectarian protests. And I think many views of the Shia society in Iraq or the Shia majority in Iraq witnessing a big shift in the support of Iran by the Shia populace to being against Iran. All the major slogan in these demonstrations today is, I'm going to say it in Arabic, Iran barra barra Baghdad tubqa hurra, which means Iran out, Baghdad will stay free. And we saw the burning of Khamenei's pictures, we saw the burning of Khomeini's pictures, and every single Shia party belongs to Iran headquarters or building was burnt. And no one of these demonstrators went and tried to raid the US embassy or the British embassy. No one chanted against Israel. they all chanted against Iran. They know who's their enemy, and they are more realistic. They have not been fed by totalitarian propaganda of Saddam. They understand the reality very well.
Well, in a sense, it resonates what we're seeing in Lebanon. What is the way to end these protests, in your view? Is there a way to eliminate the influence of overseas and foreign influence, specifically of Iran in Iraq?
Well, there are two ways. First of all, the rising of the people and the expelling of their proxies in Iraq. Unfortunately, their proxies are less than 1%, but they carry the weapons, and those demonstrators are armless. The second way is we are hoping President Trump's policy of maximum pressure on Tehran will weaken Iran enough that the Iraqi people could rise up. I don't think we're going to see a stable, a peaceful Middle East, a reasonable Middle East, I would say, without Iranian regime weakening. This regime has been creating mayhem in the region for 4 decades, and specifically after the nuclear deal, they have became in control of 4 countries in the Middle East. That would be Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. And they established a land bridge through Iraq to transfer weapons. And I'm getting updates every day about this land bridge, how they transfer weapons, even chemical weapons, to Syria and to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this is a huge instability factor in the Middle East and the national security of the United States. And I think without weakening Iran, without and I would say regime change in Tehran, we're not going to see a stable Middle East.
Entifadh, you mentioned the militias. During and after the war against ISIS, pro-Iranian militias have taken over territories in Iraq and in some parts of the country have carried out ethnic cleansing of Sunni and Kurdish populations. What's the end goal for these militias? Are they aiming to remain in those areas that they now occupy permanently?
Well, the Iranians has a strategic plan to make demographic changes in Syria and Iraq, and they are working on it every day. Shia militias who took over liberated areas from ISIS, by the way, they took over these areas with the help of the counter-terrorism units, which are the most effective fighting units in Iraq, supported by the United States and the United States Air Force. They walk in basically in these areas, and they basically started accusing every Sunni of being an ISIS. And basically, I would call it the ISISification of the Sunnis. They assume every Sunni is an ISIS, and they basically launch a wide campaign of arrest, killing, rape, and preventing even refugees from coming back. 90% or 80% of the Sunni refugees have not returned to their lands because either they are prevented or they cannot go back because there's no water, there's no electricity, there's no services, there's no schools. And this is done intentionally and systematically. Some of these areas, the Shia militias declared openly Sunnis were not going to come back because it became a stronghold for their presence and for their depots of long and middle-range missiles, which they are transferring to Iraq from Iran to be used against Israel and Saudi Arabia and U.S. allies in the region.
You mentioned the U.S. military presence on the ground in Iraq, and I wanted to ask you, Iraq's defense minister made it very clear that U.S. forces withdrawing from Syria are not welcome to stay in Iraq, in the country. We also heard over recent months lawmakers in the Iraqi parliament calling for an exit of all U.S. military forces from the country. Do you think we're going to hear more of these voices? How seriously should we take them?
I think you should take them very serious. I think there's also a double standard in Iraq. The political establishment in Iraq, which are a few hundreds, which are rotating or recycling power amongst themselves, they all coming to power now with an Iranian deal, with an Iranian thumb on them. So they already pre-sold before they take power. That's why the defense minister cannot say anything else but to speak what Tehran's language is. Look, in 2011, when the United States about to withdraw, I personally received a top secret report from the Iraqi Ministry of Defense, which showed that the Iraqi army in 2011 readiness was only 25%. But in spite of that, Maliki insisted for U.S. withdrawal. You would think he would not. He would ask the U.S. to stay until readiness reaches 75 or even 50%, but he did not because of Iran's orders. And what happened after the withdrawal? We saw that ISIS appeared and took over more than 40% of Iraq, and cost us all this civil war mayhem for the past 5 years, and even threatened the United States and the world. So this is going to be the same. A U.S. presence in Iraq is not cosmetical, is necessary to continue the fight against ISIS. ISIS has been eliminated as a state, but it's not been eliminated as a present and imminent danger every day. And they could resurge, and they could start fighting, and they could start threaten the United States and the West and Iraq and the rest of the world. So the presence of the United States forces in Iraq is necessary. You would think the Iraqi government will take this serious to protect themselves, but they cannot. Their hands are tied to Tehran, and they have to obey what Tehran is telling them.
Entifadh Qanbar, thank you for this fascinating conversation and for joining us on the Investigative Journal. Your great analysis. And thank you all for watching. That does it for this episode of TIJ Talks. I'm Tal Heinrich here in New York for the Investigative Journal. We'll see you all next time.